So now as we move forward, our next learning objective is to explain why the U.S. went to war in the Persian Gulf in 1991. So the whole thing really starts in August of 1990 when the Iraqi forces of Saddam Hussein invaded the small oil-rich country of Kuwait, which is right on the Persian Gulf. Kuwait is a U.S. ally, and they are one of the largest oil producers in the area. And the United Nations ordered the Iraqi forces to withdraw, and they were given a deadline. That deadline came and passed. Now, of course, in the lead up to this, President Bush does a great job of building a broad-based coalition of support. And so ultimately what ends up happening is when this deadline passes and Saddam Hussein has not withdrawn his forces, we go to war in Iraq with the goal of driving the Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. And as we do this, the action is not taken by the U.S. military alone, but it's taken by these coalition forces that are led by the United States. Saudi Arabia participates, letting us use their air bases. I still remember when this took place, the whole operation was known as Operation Desert Storm. And, I'll never forget that night because, people say that the Vietnam War was our first television war. And in that regard, yes, it was. But not only was it our first television war, but things were changing. Television, by the time we hit the 1990s, we now have live television. So you could say that really kind of the first Persian Gulf War of '91 is the first live television war, where we're getting live television reports. In Vietnam, the television reports weren't live. Yes, people were on the nightly news getting updates and reports on what was going on, but they weren't actually watching live feed, which is completely different. But through satellite technology, we're now getting live feed coming from the Middle East, and we're actually able to watch events as they were unfolding. And so, early on, as we first began with airstrikes, we had interviews with pilots after they'd come back from a bombing mission. And like I said, I remember the intensity of it. At the time, I was coaching wrestling at Downey High School. We had a match down in Atwater that night, which was also just happened to be a very important match that would really decide the league championship. But Atwater at that point in time had an active Air Force base, and a lot of the students from Atwater High had parents in the military, so we weren't quite sure even if the match was going to go on. We get on the bus to head down there just as the air raids are starting, and we're actually listening to news reports on the radio. And normally kids can be pretty talkative on a bus headed down there, but the kids were completely silent on the bus because everybody was listening so intently to the news reports as they were coming back. And then, after we got back that night, I remember I took one of the wrestlers home. His brother and I had been teammates in high school. So I ended up, when I dropped him off, I went in and I sat down and I was watching the news with his brother and his brother's wife, and we were watching the news reports, getting the updates, like I said, from these pilots, hearing how the raids went early on. And all of this was set up for a ground war. Then we sent in ground forces, and really very quickly were able to drive the Iraqi forces from Kuwait. The objective was achieved. That was what we went in for. The war was a huge success, and the downside is we didn't capture Saddam Hussein, and of course that ultimately would lead us into another war in Iraq in 2003. But at the time it was seen as a tremendous success because we went in, we achieved the objective of driving the Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, and we achieved it very rapidly. Bush's approval rating is really pretty much at an all-time high. He's got an approval rating well above 70%. People are very happy with him right after the end of the war. And things did begin to change shortly thereafter, though, and that's what we'll be looking at in the next section.